You don't pay rent. You don't live here." My son said it without raising his voice, as if he were explaining something obvious to a stranger. Not to his mother. Not to the woman who had carried him, fed him, held his feverish head through childhood nights. No. He spoke to me the way people speak when they've already made a decision and simply want you to accept it. I remember standing there in the doorway of my own living room, my hand still resting on the frame, as if the wood itself could steady me. The evening light fell across the carpet I had chosen 20 years ago, and yet suddenly it felt like I was trespassing in a house I had built with my own hands. My chest tightened, not from fear, but from something older, something that had been gathering dust inside me for years. Perhaps dignity dies slowly, or perhaps, like tonight, it wakes up all at once. Matthew didn't even look at me when he said it. He kept scrolling through something on his phone, tapping his thumb the way he always does when he's irritated. His wife, Claire, sat at the kitchen counter, stirring her herbal tea with that faint little smile she thinks I don't notice, the kind of smile that says, "Finally." The kind that makes a woman like me straighten her spine, even at 74. "I don't pay rent," I repeated quietly, tasting the words like something sour. "Matthew, this is my home." He sighed, tired, impatient, as if I were the one making things difficult. "Mom, please. We've talked about this. You don't contribute. We cover groceries, bills, kids' school, everything. And you just live here. Just live here." As if breathing under my own roof required their permission. I felt my fingers tremble slightly, so I folded them together, hiding it. Calm. That was always my strength. 40 years of nursing had taught me how to keep my voice even while the world fell apart around me. Tonight was no different. "I see," I said. Only 2 words. They tasted heavier than I expected. Claire glanced at Matthew and then at me, as though checking whether I understood my new role. The guest, the burden, the old woman who should be grateful for whatever corner of her own home they allowed her to occupy. But I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I simply turned away and walked down the hallway, past the family photos I had dusted that very morning. His small face in kindergarten, his gap-toothed grin at 8, the awkward teenager who once hugged me so hard after losing a soccer match that I couldn't breathe. For a moment, those pictures blurred, not from age, but from something far more bitter. In my room, I closed the door gently, not because I was afraid of disturbing them, but because I finally needed the silence. My knees ached as I sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing the quilt I had sewn back when my hands were steadier. What surprised me most was not the insult. No. What surprised me was how clear everything suddenly became. Like someone had opened a window in a room I'd been sleeping in for too long. He thought this house was his. He thought I was here by their grace. And sitting there in the dim light, I understood, not with anger, but with a quiet, cold certainty, that something in my life had shifted. For the first time in years, the thought came to me not as a whisper, but as a firm, steady voice. This is not their home. This was never their home. And I am done being invisible in it. I folded my hands in my lap and exhaled. A long, slow breath. The next steps were already taking shape in my mind. I didn't sleep that night. Not a minute. I lay there listening to the familiar sounds of the house. The refrigerator humming, the pipes settling, the branches of the oak tree brushing against the siding the way they had for decades. But even those sounds felt different now, like they belonged to a place that no longer recognized me. Strange how quickly a home can turn into just walls. Matthew and Claire moved in 6 years ago, only for a few months, as they said at the time. Matthew had lost his job, the kids were small, and they were struggling to make ends meet. I remember how he stood on this very porch, shoulders slumped, telling me he didn't know what to do. His voice trembled then. He was embarrassed. And I, foolishly soft-hearted, opened my arms and my door without a second thought. "Stay as long as you need," I told him, "because that's what mothers say. That's what I believed." At first, they were grateful. Claire brought flowers from the supermarket, cheap carnations, but it was the gesture that mattered. Matthew fixed the broken railing. The kids hugged me every morning. For a while, it felt almost like healing, having a family bustling through the rooms George and I had built together. But gratitude, I've learned, has an expiration date. By the end of the first year, they were no longer guessing whether they should use my living room. They simply used it. My kitchen became their kitchen. My quiet evenings became theirs to interrupt. My bedroom door became something they knocked on only when they needed something. "Mom, could you watch the kids again?" "Mom, do you have $20? Just until Friday." "Mom, we'll be late tonight. Don't wait up." Always, "Mom." Never, "Thank you." And somewhere in there, the language shifted. They stopped saying, "We're staying with you." They started saying, "The house." Then, "Our house." I noticed it in little things. The day Claire rearranged my pantry, saying, "It just makes more sense this way." The afternoon Matthew carried my sewing machine, my old, sturdy one, into the garage because it takes up too much space. He told me he'd bring it back later. He never did, and I let it all pass. One small concession at a time. That's how erosion works, not in earthquakes, but in the slow crumbling of pieces you barely notice losing. By the third year, they were hosting barbecues in the backyard without asking me. Neighbors would wave at them, not me. Children I didn't know ran across the lawn George planted by hand. They ruined the roses twice. Claire shrugged and said, "They're just plants." "They're not just plants," I wanted to say. But I swallowed it. I'd been swallowing things for years. Because I remembered Matthew as a boy, soft-hearted, always wanting to impress his father, always trying to be good. I remembered the way he cried at 10 when he accidentally broke George's favorite fishing rod. I remembered the terrified 18-year-old who called me from college the night he failed his first exam. And in every argument, every slight, every moment of disrespect, I kept telling myself, he's still that boy somewhere. Be patient. Be understanding. Don't push him away. But patience, too, has a cost. And understanding becomes something else, something uglier, when it's given to people who no longer see your value. Last year, they took the master bedroom. Not asked. Took. Said it would be better for the kids to be closer to their bathroom. I was moved to the smaller room at the end of the hall. I let it happen because Matthew was stressed, Claire was overwhelmed, and the children, well, the children needed stability. But what about me? When did I stop being someone they worried about? Some nights I lay awake, hearing them whisper about finances, jobs, vacations they wanted to take. Vacations I knew I would never be invited to join, and each time I reminded myself, this is temporary. Once they get on their feet, things will go back to normal. But temporary is a sly word. It gives people time to settle into entitlement. And last night, when Matthew told me I didn't pay rent, in the house I owned outright, I realized something painful and simple. They'd rewritten the story in their minds. They weren't guests anymore. I was. And somewhere deep in my chest, under all the years of silence, something finally stirred. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pride. It was the first spark of a boundary being born. The next morning, I moved through the house the way one moves through a museum of someone else's memories, carefully, quietly, as if touching anything might set off an alarm. The air itself felt different, heavier, tense, like the pause before a storm breaks. Nobody said a word to me at breakfast. Not Matthew, not Claire, not even the children, who usually greeted me out of habit if nothing else. They whispered among themselves while I made my tea. Whispered, but not softly enough. "She took the heating off again last night," Claire muttered. "I didn't touch the thermostat," I said calmly. She didn't answer, just rolled her eyes, as if I were a child caught lying. Funny, I thought. I survived double shifts in emergency rooms, raised a son alone after George died, paid off a mortgage with my own hands. Yet, here I was, accused of sabotaging the heating in a house that bore my name on every document. But that was the pattern, wasn't it? Small accusations, tiny frictions, all pointing in the same direction. "You're in our way." Later that day, I heard them in the living room. I didn't mean to listen, but the walls in this house carry voices the way old trees carry wind. "Mom doesn't understand how much pressure we're under," Matthew said. "She doesn't want to understand," Claire replied. "She's set in her ways. Everything has to be like it was 40 years ago." A pause, then softer. "She should be grateful we're here." Grateful? For what, I wondered? For being pushed aside in my own home? For hearing my life discussed like I was a malfunctioning appliance? I stood in the hallway, invisible. For a moment, I imagined stepping into the room, imagined saying something firm, sharp, honest. But the urge passed. At my age, dignity is a quiet thing. It doesn't shout. It waits. Still, something inside me cracked when I saw the boxes. Not mine. Theirs. Dozens of them stacked against the wall. Claire had labeled them neatly: seasonal decor, kitchen, office, kids' books. I froze. When had they brought all this in? How had I missed it? It wasn't temporary anymore. They were settling, rooting, expanding. Matthew walked by and saw me staring. "We're reorganizing," he said. "The house needs better storage." "The house," he said. "Not your house, not Mom's house." Just the house, as if ownership were an inconvenience. "And we were thinking," Claire added from behind him, her tone too careful to be genuine, "that maybe it's time we did something about the guest room." "What about it?" I asked. Claire exchanged a glance with Matthew. "Well, it doesn't make sense for you to have two rooms, the bedroom and the sewing room, when we're tight on space." "Tight on space?" I echoed, unable to stop the small, disbelieving laugh that escaped me. "This is a 4-bedroom house." "Yes," she said, patient in a way that grated. "But families outgrow places quickly. You know how it is." I knew exactly how it was. They wanted my sewing room, the one sanctuary I had left, the last space that felt like mine, the one room Claire never entered and Matthew never reorganized, the room where George's workbench still stood, where his old flannel shirt still hung on the back of a chair, the room that smelled faintly of cedar and thread and memories. "No," I said simply. Claire blinked. "No?" "No," I repeated. That room stays as it is. Her face tightened. We're not trying to erase anything. We just need— You have everything, I interrupted gently. Everything except boundaries. Matthew stepped forward, bristling. Mom, don't make this difficult. But I wasn't making anything difficult. I was just no longer making it easy. I walked away, leaving their irritation hanging in the air like smoke. In the sewing room, I shut the door behind me and let the quiet wash over me. The afternoon sun fell across the wooden floor, catching on a scattering of loose buttons and bits of thread. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of clarity. They didn't see this room as sacred. They didn't see the house as mine. They didn't see me at all. And for the first time, the thought that had only flickered last night began to burn steadily. If they couldn't recognize the boundaries of my home, then I would draw boundaries they could not ignore. There's a particular kind of silence that fills a house when resentment has lived in it long enough. It isn't loud, but it seeps into door frames, into carpets, into the spaces between footsteps. That's the silence I woke up to the next morning. Thick, stale, familiar in a way that made my chest ache. Matthew didn't speak to me before leaving for work. Claire offered a stiff nod, lips pressed together like she was holding back a sigh. Even the children moved around me carefully, as though some invisible boundary had appeared overnight. Perhaps it had. I made my tea, the same way I had every morning for 50 years, but it tasted different now. Bitter, like something burned. It wasn't always like this, and as much as I tried to stay in the present, memory has its own gravity, especially when the present wounds come from the same hands you once held with pride. Matthew wasn't always ashamed of me, but somewhere along the way, he began to hide parts of his upbringing the way people hide old scars, quietly, subtly, until the people around them forget they ever existed. The first time I realized something had changed was 25 years ago when he came home from college for Thanksgiving. He was different, taller, confident, polished in a way that felt practiced. He brought a girl with him, not Claire, but someone equally put together, with a laugh loud enough to fill the whole house. At dinner, she asked what I did for work. I'm a nurse, I told her. Matthew shifted in his seat. She used to be, he corrected quickly. She's semi-retired now. I was still working full-time then, I remember thinking. Why change the truth? But the girl nodded and went on talking, and Matthew didn't meet my eyes. That was the first stone in the distance that would stretch between us for decades. Then came Claire. Beautiful, composed, always dressed like she was attending a fundraiser. She never said anything cruel, not outright, but her politeness was sharp in ways only women notice. She'd look at my old oak dining table and say, "Vintage is so charming." She'd compliment my homemade curtains with, "I love how they feel nostalgic." Nostalgic, a lovely word that in her mouth meant outdated. I could handle that. I had thick skin. Life had given it to me. But slowly, things shifted. Matthew stopped inviting me to office parties, stopped introducing me to his friends, stopped saying where he grew up unless someone asked directly. And when they did, he always added a quick, "It's a small, old neighborhood." Mom kept everything very traditional. Traditional. Another word with teeth. When George died, they were attentive. For a while. But grief fades for everyone except the one who carries it. And after the funeral, after the casseroles, after the polite concerns, life moved on for them. For me, it became heavier. When they had children, I hoped things would change. I dreamed of laughter in the yard, tiny hands tugging at my apron, holidays that filled the house with warmth again. But Claire set the tone early. "We don't want them picking up outdated habits," she said once, when I tried teaching my granddaughter how to knead dough properly. Outdated habits, as if I were passing on a disease. And Matthew, my own son, nodded. Every nod widened the gap. Every silence signaled agreement. But the moment that carved itself into my memory, the moment I realized Matthew wasn't just ashamed of my house, but of me, happened 3 years ago at a fancy restaurant Claire loved. It was her birthday, and I had dressed as nicely as I could, a long navy skirt, a soft blouse, my mother's pearls. I felt almost pretty. Someone at the table asked Matthew what his parents did. "Dad worked in construction," he said proudly, then hesitated. "And your mother?" the man asked. Matthew shifted, cleared his throat. "She stayed home mostly." I nearly dropped my fork. Stayed home? I had worked 39 years in a hospital. I had held dying hands, delivered babies, saved lives, paid bills, buried a husband, kept a home running, raised a child alone. But in that moment, my son dismissed my entire life with 4 words. I didn't confront him. I didn't make a scene. I swallowed the hurt the way women of my generation often do, quietly, privately. But it lodged somewhere deep, a splinter waiting for the right moment to push its way back to the surface. And now, standing in the present, watching Matthew and Claire move through my home like it was a stage built for them, that splinter throbbed. They weren't just disrespectful, they weren't just entitled, they were rewriting history, his and mine. And last night's words had finally woken something that had lain dormant too long. You don't pay rent. You don't live here. He had no idea what those words had unlocked in me. He had no idea that the ground beneath his feet had already begun to shift. By the end of that week, the house no longer felt like a place a woman could breathe in. Not even an old woman who needs so little to feel at peace. A warm chair, a quiet cup of tea, a corner left untouched. Even those small mercies seemed to shrink each day, overtaken by someone else's plans, someone else's voices, someone else's certainty that they belonged here more than I did. The moment I finally understood just how far things had gone came on a Thursday evening. I had been sitting at the kitchen table, mending a small tear in one of the children's jackets. Something Claire kept forgetting to do, though she often reminded me how crafts are your department, Evelyn. I didn't mind. Busy hands steadied the mind. Claire came in first. She didn't greet me. She walked to the counter, poured herself sparkling water, and sighed, loudly, theatrically, the way women do when they want to be asked what's wrong. I didn't ask. Matthew followed a moment later, keys jangling, jacket half on, half off. He looked tense, preoccupied. They exchanged glances. The kind that passes like a secret note between students in a classroom. I paused my stitching, sensing the air thicken again. "Mom," Matthew began, rubbing the back of his neck, "we were talking about something earlier." Always the same opening. We were talking. We've decided. We think. Never, "What do you think, Mom?" Never that. Claire set her glass down too hard. The clink sounded like a warning. "We need to make better use of the space," she said. "The kids are growing. Matthew sometimes works from home, and the house just isn't accommodating the way we need." I set the needle down slowly. "What space are you talking about now?" Matthew exhaled. "Your room." "My room?" "I mean," he corrected quickly, "the room you're in now. The smaller one. We were thinking..." You were thinking, I repeated quietly. This time he didn't argue. We want to turn your bedroom into a shared office/storage room for the kids' things. And you could move into the small room permanently. It's easier for you anyway. Fewer stairs, closer to the bathroom. Closer to the bathroom. How thoughtful. Nothing says respect for your mother like rewriting her living arrangements under the guise of convenience. I studied their faces. Claire's eyes were bright with anticipation, not excitement, but triumph. Matthew looked guilty, but not enough, never enough to stop him. And where would I put my things? I asked. Claire waved her hand lightly. You don't have many belongings, and we can help declutter. Honestly, Evelyn, it's time. Time. For what exactly? Time to disappear into a corner? Time to fade out of the way? She kept going. The children need space. Matthew needs a workspace. And the house, I said quietly, is mine. They both stiffened. Claire blinked as if I had spoken out of turn. Matthew swallowed. Mom, we know that, but... No, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I don't think you do. For a brief second, silence swallowed the kitchen. Not the resentful kind from earlier that week, but a new silence. One shaped like a boundary finally rising from the ground. Claire recovered first. We're not trying to take anything from you, she said, but families adjust. You can't keep everything the same just because you're sentimental. Sentimental. Another word that means unreasonable old woman. My hands didn't shake this time. Instead, I picked up the jacket I'd been mending and folded it with deliberate care. When George and I built this house, I said softly, we did it room by room, paycheck by paycheck. We painted these walls ourselves. We laid this flooring piece by piece. Every decision in this house was ours. I looked at Matthew. You've never built a home. You've only moved into them. He reddened, anger creeping into his face, but he said nothing. Claire crossed her arms. Well, maybe it's time this home evolved into something that works for everyone. Everyone but me, I replied. She didn't deny it. That was the moment it happened. The moment I felt myself step outside the role I had been pushed into. The role of the quiet mother. The role of the convenient grandmother. The role of the woman who could be shifted like furniture. No, I said again, but this time the word felt heavier. Solid. My room stays where it is, and so do I. Matthew looked stunned. Claire looked offended. But I didn't wait for their arguments. I stood, pushed in my chair, and walked to the hallway. My knees hurt, my back ached, but my dignity, that old, patient thing, stood tall. Behind me, Claire hissed, "This is ridiculous." I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. Because walking down that hallway, I understood something clearly at last. They weren't just pushing me out of my space. They were pushing me toward a decision I had avoided for too long, a decision that would change everything. The weekend came, and with it came a heaviness in the air, the kind you feel before a thunderstorm. People pretend storms arrive suddenly, but older women know better. Storms announce themselves in tightening voices, in slammed drawers, in the way footsteps grow sharper on hardwood floors. That Saturday morning, I heard Matthew and Claire arguing downstairs, not whispering this time. No, their voices carried through the vents as if the house itself wanted me to hear. "She's being unreasonable," Claire snapped. "She's my mother," Matthew said, though without conviction. "And we're your family too," Claire shot back. "We can't live like this. It's cramped. It's chaotic. She gets upset over everything. A pause. We need the space, Matt. We. Funny how often that word excluded me. I sat on the edge of my bed, my robe folded neatly over my lap, listening to them try to solve the problem of me, as if I were a leaky faucet or a stubborn stain. Then Matthew said something that made my spine stiffen. She doesn't contribute. Not financially. Not with the upkeep. What does she think this is? I almost laughed. A bitter little chuckle rose to my throat, but I forced it down. I had contributed enough in my lifetime to build 2 families, not 1. Some contributions simply don't show up in bank statements. Still, the words stung. Not because they were cruel, but because he believed them. A few minutes later, Claire marched into my sewing room, without knocking, of course. "We need to talk," she announced. I kept my back turned, gathering spools of thread into a small wooden box, letting her stand there in her impatience. "Evelyn," she said sharply, "this can't continue." "What exactly can't continue, Claire?" I asked, turning slowly. She took a breath, hands clasped in front of her as if she were rehearsing sympathy. "The way you manage things around here. Bills are going up. Groceries are expensive. The kids need new clothing every few months, and Matthew and I are doing everything. We're drowning." "You're not drowning," I said gently. "You're overspending." Her eyes widened with indignation. "Excuse me? You buy organic snacks the children don't even like. You order new home decor every week. You drive 40 minutes to a salon that overcharges you because you hate budget places. Claire, you're not drowning. You're swimming in a current you created." She flushed, lips tightening. "Well, excuse me for trying to maintain a normal lifestyle." Normal. Another lovely word with a sting. "And don't take that tone with me," she added. "We're supporting you." Supporting me. The phrase settled in the room like smoke. I looked around. At the shelves George built. At the old lamp with the dented shade. At the quilt folded in the corner. At everything that spoke of a life built long before Claire was born. "Supporting me?" I repeated softly. "Claire, this house is paid off. I handled every bill here for 30 years. Property taxes, insurance, repairs, all of it. You're not supporting me. You're residing here." She let out a strained laugh. "We pay for everything now, Evelyn. You don't lift a finger toward household expenses." "Because," I said, "you moved in. I didn't invite you to split bills. I offered you shelter. There's a difference." Claire's voice sharpened. "Well, maybe things would feel more equal around here if you contributed financially." "Contribute?" I asked. "To a house that is legally mine?" Her cheeks reddened. "This isn't about paperwork. It's about fairness." Ah, yes. Fairness. A word always used when people want what isn't theirs. Matthew appeared behind her then, looking uneasy, as though he sensed something had shifted too far for him to ignore. "Mom," he started, "Claire's right. We need help." "And how much help have you calculated I owe you?" I asked calmly. He blinked. "What? You said I don't contribute. I'd like to understand the math." Matthew rubbed his temples. "Mom, please don't make this adversarial." "I'm not," I said, stepping toward them, "but I do want the truth." Claire crossed her arms. "It would make things easier if you paid rent. Just a symbolic amount. To show appreciation." Appreciation. For being allowed to live in the home I owned. "How much?" I asked. Claire hesitated, then said, "Something fair. Maybe 1,200. 1,200, I repeated. Per month." "Yes." A silence stretched between us, thick and charged. Matthew looked down. Claire looked triumphant. I looked at the doorway, at the place where, years ago, George used to lean after long work shifts, smelling faintly of sawdust and cold air. "I see," I said finally. Those two words again. Simple, bare. But they carried a weight neither of them recognized. Then I added quietly, "Thank you for clarifying where we stand." And before they could respond, I walked past them. Not hurried, not shaking, simply moving with a certainty they had not seen from me in years. Because now I understood. This wasn't care. This wasn't family. This was a transaction they had rewritten in their heads. And if they wanted to talk money, then money and documents were exactly where I would go next. By Monday, the tension in the house had settled into something almost physical. It clung to the walls like humidity, made every breath feel heavier. Claire moved around with clipped footsteps, as if the floor itself annoyed her. Matthew avoided meeting my eyes entirely. The children tiptoed, sensing something grown-ups refused to name. But I had already named it. And once a truth has a name, it can no longer be buried. That afternoon, I overheard them again. Not intentionally, but because voices carry differently in a house someone tries to take over. They were in the living room, the one I had furnished with my own hands, years before either of them existed. Claire's voice was sharp, controlled. "We have to decide. We can't keep living like this. The house is wasted on her." "Wasted. On me." Matthew sighed. "She's not going to just agree to move out." "She will," Claire insisted. "She's old. People her age don't fight these things. And if she does, well, we'll handle it." Handle it. As if I were a legal issue, not a person. I stepped back into the hallway before they could see I was there. My heart wasn't racing. Instead, something quieter settled inside me. The same quiet I used to feel before delivering difficult news to a patient. A professional, steady quiet. Later that evening, I found a stack of papers left carelessly on the kitchen counter. Insurance documents, school papers, and a folder labeled Future Home Plans. Curiosity didn't drive me. Instinct did. I opened it. Inside were printed floor plans of my house. Rearranged, remodeled, walls removed, bedrooms converted. Sections were highlighted, notes scribbled in Claire's looping handwriting. "Knock down this wall for an open layout. Turn Evelyn's sewing room into nursery. Use her bedroom for dual office. Storage space from her closets. Her closets, my rooms, my home." It wasn't remodeling, it was erasure. And then the real blow. At the bottom of the stack, a printed article titled, "How to Talk to Aging Parents About Assisted Living." Highlighted. Annotated. So that was their plan. Not just to push me aside, but to push me out entirely. I closed the folder carefully, set it back exactly as I'd found it, and walked to the window. Outside, dusk was settling over the yard. George's oak tree stood tall, silhouetted against the fading sky. He planted it the year Matthew was born. Each ring inside its trunk held a piece of our life together. I placed my hand on the windowsill, the old wood smooth beneath my palm. I whispered, not out of weakness, but because truth sounds stronger when spoken softly. They think this house is theirs. And then, after a breath, they have no idea. Because in that moment, something clicked into place with the finality of a locked door. This wasn't about bedrooms or storage. It wasn't about bills. It wasn't even about respect anymore. This was about ownership of my home, my history, my remaining years. They had redrawn their version of the story. Now it was my turn to draw lines they would not cross. I walked back to my sewing room, closed the door behind me, and sat at George's old workbench. My knees ached. My fingers weren't as nimble as they once were, but my mind was steadier than ever. There, under the soft lamplight, I opened the drawer where I kept all my important documents, the ones no one else bothered to ask about. The deed, the will, the property tax records. Every proof of ownership neatly arranged. Everything bearing one name. Mine. They thought I wouldn't fight. They assumed old age meant surrender. But they forgot something essential. A woman who has lived a long life knows exactly what she can lose, and exactly what she refuses to give up. The next morning began quietly. The kind of quiet that feels rehearsed. Matthew and Claire moved around the kitchen with exaggerated politeness, their voices soft, their footsteps light, as if I were a fragile object that might crack if addressed too directly. I'd seen this behavior before in hospital corridors, the hush that precedes delivering bad news. Except this time, I wasn't the one receiving it. I was the one preparing it. I sat at the table with my tea, watching them dance around their unspoken plans. Claire avoided eye contact. Matthew cleared his throat twice, a habit he never outgrew, usually signaling he needed something from me. "Mom," he finally said, "we've been thinking about long-term arrangements." I stirred my tea once, slowly. "Is that so?" Claire stepped in, tone dripping with a sweetness that didn't quite mask the sour underneath. "We just want you to be comfortable. You know, in a place that's more suited to someone your age." My age. A weapon disguised as concern. I looked at her. Really looked. "Claire, you mean assisted living?" She blinked, startled that I wasn't playing along with the script. "Well, yes. It would be best for everyone. You'd have help, support, activities, and we'd finally have room to what?" I asked. "Spread out, redecorate, take over?" Matthew flinched as if I'd slapped him. "Mom," he said defensively, "you're twisting things. We just want what's fair." Fair. It was always that word. He continued, "It's unrealistic for you to stay here forever. The house is big, the upkeep is a lot, and you don't exactly contribute?" I finished for him. He shut his mouth. I let the silence stretch, thick and heavy. Then I stood up, slowly, because my knees have their own stubbornness, and placed my cup in the sink. "There will be no assisted living," I said. "Not now, not later." Claire's mask slipped. "Evelyn, you don't get to make that decision alone." That was the moment I felt something inside me harden. Not cruelty, not anger. Something cleaner, like a line drawn neatly across a page. "Actually," I said, turning back to them, "I do." Matthew's face reddened. "Mom, you can't expect us to live like this. We need to plan ahead. You can't just—" "I already have," I said. He blinked. "What?" But before he could press further, the front doorbell rang. A sharp, firm chime that did not belong to friends or neighbors. Claire's eyebrows shot up. "Who's that?" I didn't answer. Instead, I walked to the foyer, my steps slow but sure. When I opened the door, the cool morning air slipped in, along with a familiar figure. Mr. Sullivan, my attorney for the last 15 years. He gave me a respectful nod. "Good morning, Mrs. Jarrett. I have the documents you requested." Behind me, I heard Claire's breath catch. Matthew's footsteps approached fast. "What documents?" Matthew demanded. Mr. Sullivan looked past me, expression unreadable. Property confirmation, updated deed copies, and the notice you asked me to prepare. The house felt suddenly smaller, shrinking around the weight of those words. Matthew sputtered, "Mom, what notice?" I met his eyes, my son's eyes, the same shade of brown he had at 5 years old when he reached for my hand crossing the street. But this wasn't that boy, and I wasn't that mother anymore. "A notice to vacate," I said quietly. Claire staggered back as if the words had force. "Vacate? You're evicting us?" "I'm asking you," I corrected, "to find your own home, the one you keep planning renovations for, the one you believe you deserve." Matthew looked stunned, almost childlike. You can't do that. This house," I said, "is mine. It always has been. And you stopped treating it, and me, with respect a long time ago." Silence fell, sharp as broken glass. Behind me, Mr. Sullivan waited, professional, steady. In front of me stood the two people who had spent years convincing themselves the roof over their heads belonged to them. And between us, finally, stood the truth they could no longer rearrange like furniture. After Mr. Sullivan left, the house fell into a stunned, uneasy quiet. Not the quiet of peace. No, this one had edges. It scraped at the walls. It hovered above the stairs. It followed my footsteps like a shadow that wasn't mine. Matthew and Claire shut themselves in their bedroom. I heard their voices rise, fall, rise again. They spoke in urgent, panicked tones. Tones of people who finally realize a door they thought stood wide open is, in fact, locked from the inside. By me. I walked into the sewing room, my sanctuary, and closed the door gently. For a long moment, I simply stood there, letting the familiar smell of cedar and old fabric settle into my lungs. My fingers ran along George's workbench, tracing the nicks he left in the wood long ago. Funny how a man's presence can linger in the smallest imperfections. I sat down slowly. My knees complained, but today their ache felt like a reminder that I had carried the weight of this family long enough. That strength sometimes hides in bones that creak. I pulled out a small wooden box from the bottom drawer. Inside were photographs I hadn't touched in years, not because they hurt, but because they carried too much truth. Truth I hadn't wanted to look at, truth I had tucked away like an unpaid bill. There was one picture of Matthew at age 8. Arms wrapped around George's leg, smiling so wide his eyes nearly disappeared. George had just built him a treehouse then, a crooked little thing with uneven steps that Matthew adored because Dad made it with his hands. And then another picture. Matthew at 18, standing tall but still close enough to me that our shoulders touched. I remembered that day. His acceptance letter to the university had arrived, and he told me he'd make us proud. Somewhere between those photographs and the man in my hallway shouting about fairness, something had gone terribly, quietly wrong. I held the pictures in my hands until my eyes blurred. Then I set them down gently, wiped my palms on my skirt, and breathed out the truth I had carried for years. He began drifting long before he moved into this house, and I kept pretending he hadn't. Losing George had carved a hole in Matthew, too. They were close, closer than most fathers and sons. When George died, Matthew lost his anchor, and I lost the man who understood both of us. The two of us floated separately after that, each pretending we weren't drowning. Maybe that's where the distance began. Maybe that's when he started seeking validation somewhere else, in people who valued polished surfaces more than roots. But even acknowledging all that didn't soften what he'd done. Pain can explain behavior, but it can't excuse betrayal. A soft knock sounded at the door. "Mom?" Matthew's voice, small, unsure, almost boyish. "Can we talk?" I didn't answer immediately. I needed a moment to gather myself, not because I feared confrontation, but because I wanted to face him with clarity, not old wounds. He opened the door slightly. His face looked older somehow, or perhaps just stripped of entitlement for the first time in years. "Mom," he repeated, stepping inside. "You blindsided us." "Did I?" I asked quietly. "Or did you misunderstand silence for permission?" He swallowed hard. We assumed." "Yes," I said. "You assumed. And assumed. And kept assuming." He sat on the low stool near the window, the same one he used to sit on as a child while George taught him how to sand wood properly. His voice cracked. "Why didn't you tell us you were unhappy?" I looked at him, this grown man who somehow still believed mothers exist only in relation to their children's comfort. "Because every time I opened my mouth," I said softly, "you rearranged the story so it wouldn't inconvenience you." He flinched. "Mom," he whispered, "are you really going through with this? The notice? The eviction?" "Claire. She's devastated." "Claire," I repeated, "is devastated because she learned the house she had already designed in her mind was never hers." He didn't deny it. "Matthew," I continued, "you were not guests anymore. You became occupiers. And when people occupy what they do not own long enough, they forget whose labor built it." He covered his face with his hands. "Give us time," he said finally. "Please." "I did," I answered. 6 years of time." He looked up at me then, really looked. And for a moment, I saw the child he used to be, the boy who trusted me, the boy I raised alone. But tenderness is not the same as surrender. "You have 30 days, I said gently. "And if you need help finding a rental, I'll help you. But you will move." He nodded slowly, resignedly, and then quietly. "I didn't know you had this in you." I exhaled, tired and steady. "You never looked closely enough." The following morning, a strange calm settled over me. Not the calm of peace, but the kind that comes after a decision has rooted itself so deeply that doubt can no longer reach it. I moved through the house slowly, touching the banister George varnished with his own hands, opening curtains I had sewn decades ago, letting in a pale wash of winter light. This was my home. And for the first time in years, the house seemed to remember it too. After breakfast, I called Mr. Sullivan to confirm our next steps. My voice didn't tremble once. "Mrs. Jarrett," he said, "the deed is clear, sole ownership, no claims from your son, no co-signers, no transfers. You're protected." Protected. A word that should have comforted me, but instead left a faint ache. I hadn't realized how long I'd been unprotected inside my own walls. "We'll finalize the notice and send the formal letter today," he continued. "Good," I replied. "I want it done properly." Once I hung up, I sat at the dining table, reviewing the folder of documents he'd left with me. The title, the tax records, even the old copy of the will George and I had rewritten after Matthew graduated. Everything was in my name. Every page was a reminder of years of sweat, sacrifice, and steady, unglamorous work. Claire passed through the room on her way to the kitchen. Her steps faltered when she saw the papers spread across the table. "You're really serious about this," she said, voice tight. I looked up at her. "Yes." She let out a humorless laugh. "You're choosing paperwork over your family." "I'm choosing respect," I said. "If family cannot give it, then paper must." Her jaw clenched, but she didn't argue further. She was learning, slowly, that I was no longer the easy opponent she'd grown accustomed to. A few minutes later, Matthew entered, hair rumpled, shoulders slumped. He looked like a man waking from a dream that had been pleasant only for him. "Mom," he said quietly, "I talked to Claire. We're still taking this in." "I understand," I replied. "But understanding doesn't change the timeline." He nodded, defeated. "I know." For the first time, I saw something fragile flicker across his face. Not just fear of losing the house, but the dawning realization of what he had done, of how far he had drifted, of how little space he had left in his own mother's life by taking so much of hers. "We'll start looking for a place," he said, "but it'll take time." "You have 30 days, I repeated gently. "If you need help organizing things, I will help. But the move will happen." He nodded again, slower this time. As he walked away, I felt a bittersweet tug in my chest. Not regret, not guilt. Something quieter. The mourning of what could have been. Had love been treated with care instead of convenience? Later, I stepped outside onto the porch. The air was cold enough to nip at my cheeks. George's oak tree rustled overhead, its branches bare but strong. I rested my hand against its trunk. "I'm doing what we should have done sooner," I whispered to him. A breeze swept through the yard, gentle and approving. Inside, I heard boxes being pulled from closets. Quiet, murmuring. The beginning of departure. For the first time in many years, the house didn't feel crowded. It felt like it was beginning to breathe again. And so was I. The formal notice went out on a Tuesday. A plain envelope, cream-colored, unassuming, almost delicate considering the weight of what it carried. I placed it carefully on the hallway table where Matthew and Claire couldn't miss it. No dramatics, no ceremony. Just truth written in legal language, the kind that doesn't tremble or hesitate. When Matthew found it, he didn't speak at first. He just stared at the letter, his shoulders rising and falling with shallow, uneven breaths. Claire hovered behind him, lips pressed tight, eyes sharp with something between outrage and fear. 30 days, she read aloud, voice cracking. "This is insane." Matthew looked at me, and there was something raw in his eyes. Not anger this time, but disbelief that I had truly crossed the line he never thought I'd approach. "Mom," he whispered, "how can you do this?" I folded the dish towel I'd been holding and set it on the counter. "The same way you could talk about removing me from my own home," I said softly. "The same way you discussed assisted living behind a closed door." He winced. "I'm your son," he said. "Doesn't that mean anything to you?" "Of course it does," I replied. "But being someone's mother doesn't mean surrendering the rest of my life to their convenience." Claire stepped forward. "We apologized. We said we'd fix things. Why isn't that enough?" I studied her face. The desperation there wasn't about losing me. It was about losing the comfort, the security, the lifestyle she had built on a foundation that was never hers. "You didn't apologize," I said. "You panicked." Matthew's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. "You apologized that I reacted," I continued. "Not for what you did." He opened his mouth, but I raised a hand to stop him. My voice stayed calm, steady. The voice of a woman who has spent a lifetime soothing others while carrying her own storms. You treated me like an obstacle, I said. You tried to make decisions about my home, my rooms, my future. You planned renovations, took over spaces, spoke about me as though I were already halfway gone. Matthew looked down at the letter again. His fingers tightened around the page. I didn't realize, he murmured, that things had gone that far. They had, I said, and you didn't see it because you didn't want to. Claire exhaled sharply, pacing. So what? We're just supposed to pack up our lives and leave, just like that. Just like that, I echoed quietly. Yes. She stopped pacing. You're being selfish, Evelyn. I let the word sit in the air. It didn't sting. It didn't even touch me. For once, I said, I'm choosing myself. If that looks like selfishness to you, then you never knew me at all. A muscle in Matthew's cheek twitched. He looked around the house. The walls he took for granted, the floors he walked as if they belonged to him. His voice dropped to something almost fragile. Where are we supposed to go? There are dozens of places to rent in town, I told him, and I will help you look. But this house is no longer yours to shape. A long silence followed. Not angry, not defiant, just hollow. The sound of something collapsing gently inside him. I thought you'd always need me, he whispered. I shook my head. I will always love you. But needing you? I smiled. A sad, tired smile. That was never the agreement. He nodded slowly, as if each movement weighed him down. And for the first time in years, Matthew truly saw me. Not as someone to lean on, not as an extension of his life, not even as an obstacle, but as a woman with her own will, a woman capable of asking and enforcing her worth. His voice broke. We'll start packing. The days that followed were strangely quiet, not the hostile quiet from before, but a subdued, exhausted one. A quiet of people packing up a dream they should never have claimed. Boxes appeared in the hallway, half filled, half forgotten. Drawers hung open. The house felt like it was slowly exhaling the weight it had been holding for years. Matthew carried most of the boxes himself, shoulders slumped, as though each cardboard flap reminded him of something he'd taken for granted. Claire moved briskly, but even her sharpness had dulled. Her steps were quicker, her annoyance more transparent. Not the triumphant irritation she used to wear, but the startled kind, like someone who'd miscalculated a very important equation. They spoke less, and when they did, their voices stayed low. On the fourth evening, Matthew knocked on my door. Not barged in, not hovered. Knocked. The way a man does when he remembers he is entering someone else's space. Come in, I said. He stepped inside, holding a small box. These are yours, he murmured, setting it gently on my dresser. I opened it. Inside were small things. Buttons, pins, a pair of shears I thought I'd lost, and one of George's old pocket knives. Items that had drifted into the general tide of their belongings, swallowed up by clutter and carelessness, now returned like overdue apologies. Claire found them in our closet, he said. I nodded, running a thumb across the worn handle of the pocket knife. Mom, he continued, seating himself awkwardly on the chair across from me, I want you to know, I never meant to hurt you. People rarely mean to. Intent doesn't erase impact. Still, I let him speak. I guess. He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. I got used to things being easy here. You kept the house warm. The kids loved having you around. Claire liked the space. You liked the security, I corrected softly. Not me. He didn't argue. A long silence followed. He stared at the carpet, as though searching for some version of himself he still recognized. When he finally lifted his gaze, he looked older, not in years, but in humility. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked. "About how you felt?" "I did," I said. "Just not in words you wanted to hear. You mistook my patience for agreement." My silence for permission. His eyes glistened. "I don't know how to fix this." "You don't fix it," I said gently. "You learn from it." He bowed his head as if receiving a truth he wasn't ready for. Claire approached the doorway then, hovering with her arms crossed. But this time, there was no sharpness in her posture, no triumph or disdain, only a rigid, uncomfortable vulnerability. "Evelyn," she said, "I took some of your books by accident. I put them on your bed." I nodded. "Thank you." She hesitated, then added, "And I'm trying. I know it doesn't look like it, but I am. Trying to accept consequences? Trying to let go of a house she'd already redesigned in her mind? Trying to understand a woman she had underestimated?" I didn't ask. Instead, I said, "Effort matters, even this late." That seemed to catch her off guard. She blinked, then stepped back into the hall, unsure what to do with gentleness. After she left, Matthew spoke again. "We found a rental," he said. "Small place, closer to the kids' school. We'll sign the lease tomorrow." I breathed in slowly. Not out of relief, though there was some, but because the shift felt enormous, like a tectonic plate finally settling into its rightful place. "That's good," I said. He nodded. "We'll be out of the house in 2 weeks." Sooner than the notice required, later than the respect should have come. He stood, wiped his palms on his jeans, and moved toward the door. But before stepping out, he turned back. "I know you won't say it," he murmured, "but I'm sorry." I didn't let him off the hook with a quick, soft, "It's okay," because it wasn't. Instead, I answered with something truer. "I'm glad you finally see it." He nodded again, slow, heavy, and left the room. For the first time in years, the house felt still. Not tense, not crowded, just still. A stillness that belonged to me again. Moving day crept closer the way winter does, not suddenly, but with a steady, undeniable presence. The house grew more bare with each passing hour. Shelves emptied, closets breathed again, corners that had been buried under toys and unused furniture revealed themselves like old friends stepping back into the light. It was strange, watching them pack. There was no shouting now, no arguments about fairness, no thinly veiled critiques about my age or habits. Just the quiet rustle of cardboard, the thud of boxes closing, the kind of silence that follows a lesson learned too late. On Thursday afternoon, Claire dropped a heavy stack of folded blankets onto the couch. She stood there for a moment, arms crossed, staring at the living room wall, the one where their family photos had hung. Only faint outlines remained, squares of brighter paint where sunlight hadn't touched. She turned to me. "It looks empty," she said softly. "For now," I replied. She hesitated. "It won't feel strange for you? Being here alone again?" "Strange isn't the worst thing," I said. "Disrespected is worse." That stopped her cold. She lowered her gaze, fingers tightening around the edge of a blanket. "I didn't mean for things to go that way," she murmured. "I know you didn't mean to," I answered. "But meaning nothing doesn't undo anything." For once, she didn't argue. Instead, she nodded, small, stiff, but genuine. Later that evening, when the children were in their room and the house was wrapped in a tired hush, Matthew approached me in the hallway. He held a box labeled garage, tools, but he didn't set it down. He just stood there, shifting his weight, as if unsure how to begin. "Mom," he said, "Claire's struggling." "Moving is hard," I said. "It's not just that." He rubbed the back of his neck. "She feels like you're angry at her." I met his eyes. "Matthew, I'm not angry. I'm awake." He blinked, absorbing that. "I spent years shrinking so the two of you could spread out," I continued. "Years biting my tongue so you wouldn't feel criticized, or unwelcome, or judged." I paused. "But you judged me anyway." Matthew lowered the box to the floor. "We were wrong," he said, voice low. "I see that now." "Good," I answered. "Seeing is the first step. Changing is the second." He sank onto the bench by the staircase, elbows on his knees. For a long time, he didn't speak. The weight of everything he hadn't noticed over the years pressed down on him visibly. "I didn't know how far we'd drifted," he finally whispered. "You didn't look back often enough," I replied. A long silence settled between us, not sharp this time. Softer, almost reflective. He sighed, rubbing his face with both hands. "Mom, can I ask something? Honestly?" "Yes. When we're gone, will you be okay?" I considered his question carefully. I had asked myself the same thing countless nights, staring at the ceiling while the house groaned under the weight of other people's footsteps. "I'll be lonely sometimes," I admitted, "but loneliness is cleaner than disrespect." He nodded slowly, painfully. I could almost see the realization forming, that the security he had grown used to was never owed to him, that I had given far more than he had ever thought to offer back. "I don't want this to be the last thing between us," he said quietly. "It won't be," I answered. "But it has to be the turning point." He looked up, eyes weary but clearer than I had seen in years. "I'll try," he said. "I know," I replied, "and trying starts with leaving." He didn't flinch this time. He simply accepted it. He stood, picked up the box and carried it out to the car. Watching him walk away, I felt no triumph, no bitterness, just a slow, steady reclaiming of space, inside the house and inside myself. The storm had come and passed, and whatever came next, I would face it with the dignity that had carried me through a lifetime. The morning they moved out was pale and cold, the kind of morning where breath hangs in the air like unspoken words. I stood by the window, watching Matthew load the last of the boxes into the back of the car. Claire checked straps and buckles with brisk mechanical movements. The children sat quietly, bundled in coats, their small faces subdued in a way that made my heart twist, not with regret, but with the tenderness age never quite loses. I had packed them lunches, not because I needed to, not because it would soften anything, but because it felt like a final act of decency in a story that had grown too tangled to hold much of it. When they finally stepped inside for the last sweep of the house, their footsteps echoed differently. Lighter, as though the house itself had already begun shedding their presence. Claire approached first. She stopped a few feet from me, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. I expected bitterness. She was good at that. But when she finally spoke, her voice was surprisingly small. "Thank you," she said, "for letting us stay as long as we did." I nodded. "I hope you find a home you can truly build together." For once, she didn't bristle. She simply swallowed, then turned away before emotion could betray her face. Matthew lingered behind. He walked through the living room slowly, fingers grazing the walls, the mantel, the worn arm of George's old chair. When he reached me, his shoulders sagged under the weight of words he seemed afraid to offer. "I don't know how to say goodbye," he murmured. "You're not saying goodbye," I said gently. "You're saying, I understand." He closed his eyes briefly, as if memorizing the shape of the moment. Then he stepped forward and hugged me. Not a rushed gesture, not a half-hearted squeeze, but a full, steady embrace, the kind he hadn't given me since he was a teenager. His breath trembled against my shoulder. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Again, but differently this time. Not a plea, a truth. "I know," I answered. When he finally pulled away, he looked older, humbled, softened in a way that didn't erase the harm, but at least acknowledged it. The children came next. They hugged me tightly, confused, quiet. I held them for a long time, long enough to feel their warmth seep into my bones. When they left my arms, something inside me loosened, not breaking, just opening. At the doorway, Matthew paused. He looked back at me with a kind of reverence, perhaps for the first time. "We'll visit," he said softly. "You will," I replied, "when the time is right." He nodded, a sad little smile touching the corner of his mouth. Then he walked out, closing the door gently behind him. The silence that followed was immense. I stood still for a long moment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of the settling floors, the distant sound of their car pulling away. The house didn't feel empty. It felt restored. I walked from room to room, touching surfaces reclaimed after years of subtle erosion. The air was clearer. The walls seemed taller. Light reached corners long buried beneath other people's belongings. When I reached the master bedroom, my bedroom again, I rested my hand on the doorframe and exhaled deeply, not with sadness, not with triumph, with relief. I opened the windows, letting in a rush of crisp air. Curtains fluttered, dust lifted. A house rediscovered its breath. So did I. I spent the rest of the afternoon quietly putting things back where they belonged. My sewing machine returned to its rightful place, my books stacked neatly. George's flannel folded on the chair, exactly where I liked it. By evening, the sun dipped low, painting the floor in long amber stripes. I made myself a cup of tea, just one cup, just for me, and sat in the silence that no longer hurt. For the first time in years, I felt not alone, but accompanied by something steadier than people. My own dignity, my own space, my own life, unshared, unshadowed, wholly mine. The first night alone in the house felt strange, but not frightening. It was as if the walls were waiting for my voice again, the way one waits for an old friend who finally comes home. I moved through the quiet rooms, turning off lights, touching familiar corners, listening to the stillness settle into itself. There were no footsteps above me, no slammed doors, no hurried whispers. The silence was full, not hollow. I made myself a simple supper, soup and half a sandwich, and ate it at the kitchen table without rushing. No one picked apart my habits. No one questioned the way I folded my napkin or the brand of tea I preferred. The small freedoms of living alone are invisible until someone tries to take them. When the dishes were washed and the counters wiped, I stepped out onto the back porch. The sky was a deep blue, the kind George used to call evening's first promise. The oak tree he planted stood strong, quiet, unwavering. I sat down in the rocking chair he built, Its joints creaked, but then again, so did mine. Age isn't a flaw when it has earned its place. I wrapped a shawl over my shoulders and let the cool air settle around me. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like someone was watching, judging, waiting for me to slip. I didn't feel like an object to be managed. I felt like myself, an older woman with a sharp mind, steady hands, and a heart that had carried more than most. It occurred to me then that I wasn't reclaiming the house. I was reclaiming the woman who had lived in it. Matthew called once that evening. A short message, polite but unsure. I didn't answer. I let it ring. Not out of bitterness, but because healing has its own pace, and tonight wasn't a night for explanations. It was a night for rest. I brewed chamomile tea, sat by the living room window, and watched the moon rise over the yard. Its soft light touched everything the way kindness should. Quietly, without taking anything in return. As I sipped my tea, I thought about the years I had spent shrinking myself to make others comfortable. How I had allowed that slow erosion, believing patience was the same as love. But patience without respect is simply waiting for someone else to give you permission to exist. I finally understood that. A life, just like a house, needs boundaries. Doors that close. Rooms that are off limits. Spaces where your own breath is the only one you hear. When I finished my tea, I set the cup in the sink and stood by the dining table. The notice copies were still there, neatly stacked, ready to be filed away. I placed them in a folder, slid it into the cabinet, and closed the door with a gentle click. Not an ending, a closure, the kind that frees something inside you. Before bed, I walked through each room slowly, touching nothing, just appreciating presence. My presence. It felt like returning to myself after a long, unmarked absence. In the bedroom, I pulled back the covers, smoothed the sheets, and lay down with a sigh that felt like truth. The house hummed softly around me. Not lonely, not empty, just mine. And as I closed my eyes, I thought of every older woman who has ever been made to feel small in a place she built with her own hands. If someone ever tries to push you out of your own life, remember this. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to draw lines. You are allowed to say no, even if your voice trembles. And if this story touched you, if it reminded you of your own strength, your own quiet battles, then let it stay with you. Share it, leave a comment, or pass it to another woman who needs to hear it.